My name is Mark Warren, and I live in Dahlonega, Georgia, where I run a wilderness school teaching the survival skills of the Cherokee to public classes. When I was 9 years old, I picked up a book called Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. And it's amazing to me that I picked the book up at all because I wasn't a reader back then. But when I read this book, I was so taken with the stories, the vignettes of courage that were portrayed in this book. And I was already fascinated with the concept of courage. I thought that courage was one of the most important characteristics that a person ever deals with because it truly defines us to a depth that we don't define ourselves on a day-to-day basis. So once I read this book, I followed it up with others on Wyatt Earp and absorbed as much as I could about how the record had been kept. And what I didn't know at that time, of course, was that most things that were written in that era, this would have been back in the early 50s, were written so that Americans, boys and girls, could have heroes. And history has always been sanitized, especially in America, where we have so much history that has been hidden from us, that eventually I got to an age where I wanted to learn what the truth was about it. Because anytime that a legend comes out, that somebody uses hyperbole and really invention to increase the stature of his protagonist, there's always going to be somebody who comes out of the woodwork eventually to argue it or to debunk it. And so you have both of these forces going at once, the hero builders and the debunkers, and the readers left in the middle to wonder which is which. So that's where I was, and I wanted to know much more about it. I'm going to go back to that year when I was 9, though, because something interesting that happened was I took that book over to my grandparents' house one day, and my grandfather picked it up and said, "Are you interested in this?" I said, "Yeah, I'm really taken with it." So he said, "Come back here with me." And we walked down there, his dark hallway, into a room that I had never been allowed to go into, and that was my grandparents' bedroom. And there was a chest of drawers there, and it's sitting right there. I inherited that chest of drawers. And in that second drawer from the top, my grandfather opened it up, and I remember stretching up on my tiptoes to look down in that drawer. And in it were a Colt 45 and a golden badge and a couple of other guns. You can imagine where that took me. So he told me then, I'd never known this, that he had been the sheriff of Fulton County, which is Atlantis County. And for me, I felt like a door had just been opened up to show me that I was not that far away from the history of someone like Wyatt Earp. It just wasn't that long ago. My grandfather could possibly have intersected with him. Even my mother was born 10 years before Wyatt Earp would die. So you suddenly get a sense of how truly this is all a chain of time that you are definitely connected to. And knowing that my grandfather had been a a sheriff was to me almost like a license to to feel that I belonged to this part of history. So I grew up with these two debates going on and trying to learn how to balance them, and it got very extreme at some point because there were some historians who simply made up so much material and tried to pass themselves off as the ultimate experts. And that's when I learned about some organizations that existed. Now, the precursors to the Wild West History Association, of which I'm a member, a very proud member, were a couple of other organizations that had once split because of differences. But I joined both of them to really glean the information that was being done by researchers. And this is where I first contacted the great researchers of our time in the history of our Western America. And through those, by going to the annual conventions and by also spending a lot of time on my own going to all the places that interested me in the West and meeting local people and talking to local historians, I got a sense of the depth of research that could be done from our time. Now, I don't consider myself a researcher of that caliber. I am more of a gatherer and an appreciator of all the research that's been done. And there are so many of those who are in the Wild West History Association now that organization can serve as really the resource of anyone who's wanting to write about these times. Because you're going to find a so-called expert in almost every field of the Old West you can imagine. You know, whether it's the mining side of it, or outlawry, or homesteading, or Civil War in the West, lawmen, women and their roles. There's somebody in this organization who can just turn on that guiding light for you. Some of the most important people that I've met have been Bob McCubbin, Casey Tiefer Tiller, Gary Roberts, Peter Brand, and there's a long list of people that I haven't met. I should add to that list Jeff Morey. All of these people have done such very fine research, and it became clear to me through my own growth which people I could trust and which I could not. Some people were very conscientious about their work, but perhaps misguided. But this organization tends to serve as one that has checks and balances on all that. And you get really good, healthy debates about the points of Old West history that are still controversial. Some of them may never be balanced out, but the conversation that goes on about them is just brilliant and helpful. Now, my interest in the Old West, I can probably attribute a lot of that, as I'm sure you two in this room can with me, Pam and Eddie. We grew up in a time when television began, and at least I did. And I remember very vividly when television first became an item in the American family household. And we grew up with so many Westerns that it would be hard for a person of these days, a young person, to believe that there were that many Westerns. I think somebody counted them, and there were about 37 different Western series. So every night there was something that was available to us, and it was all homogenized and sanitized and made to look innocent in the sense of the violence that occurred. For example, heroes often shot the gun out of the villain's hand, and things that just weren't done unless by accident in the Old West. But the resources that exist to help people like me who are writers and who have just almost an innate interest in the Old West have a gem of a resource in WWHA. My series of books on Wyatt Earp have been really a lifelong experience, because even though I accumulated a great amount of information through my studies, I could not get into the head of Wyatt Earp to write his story for decades. I could probably tell you most every little event that occurred and maybe when it occurred, but to get into his head was something that took a long time for me, and I'll tell you why that was. I mentioned to you earlier that I was very interested in the concept of courage. And because of the way that first book written by Stuart Lake, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, because of the way that it was written, it was very, very easy for me to translate Wyatt Earp's actions into stories of courage. But that got so ingrained in my head that I guess I started with that as my building block number one in my study of him. So it was hard to remove that after I began studying. But throughout my studies, I had been told so many times by people back in history, like Bat Masterson. Now, I've never met Bat Masterson, but he told me through his writing that of all the people he'd met in the West, only a few had he met whom he considered absolutely devoid of physical fear. And one of those was Wyatt Earp. When I read that as a child, I interpreted that as courageous man. Bill Tillman said the same thing. He was a very famous lawman who ended up making quite a career in Oklahoma. So his is a name in its own right. He said the same thing about Wyatt Earp, that he knew no fear. Another one was a lawyer in Wichita, and he saw something that Wyatt Earp did that made him say, "That was the nerviest thing I've ever seen, and this man simply knows no fear." A young man on the Los Angeles Police Department named Arthur King joined up with Wyatt for some ventures. Part of that was undercover work for the police department to bring in people from Mexico to kind of cut the corner on extradition. And one quote that Arthur King has on Wyatt Earp is, "He's a very congenial man, very straightforward, and he knew no fear." So here are all these people from history telling me this very thing I needed to know, but I wasn't listening to it. And when it finally dawned on me, the difference in these two things, that's what allowed me to write my books. A person who shows courage must overcome fear to act. A person who knows no fear does not have that hurdle. He has, or she has, a confidence in his abilities to solve a problem. And that was Wyatt Earp. He was a person who walked straight ahead to a problem to resolve it. His brother Virgil, another famous lawman, was the very same way, often described that way. A straight ahead person. Many writers have called Wyatt Earp a very complex man. And I think that they use that word because you see so many portions of his life where he's wearing a badge and he's doing something pretty incredible that most people would not do. But then when he's not wearing a badge, you see him slip on the other side and do something unlawful because he feels like he can get away with it. And it's profitable. That's the complicated thing about Wyatt Earp, I suppose. But for me, I consider him to be a very simple person, very uncreative, very apolitical, even though he would be very anxious for you to know that he was a Republican and stood with that business end of the industrialism of America. But he had no talent at all in politics, which was a great disadvantage for him because he had so much ambition to make himself a better known person. He didn't want to be known for law. He wanted to be known as someone who made money, someone successful, a businessman. So, his straight-ahead manner and his simplicity and the fact that he knew no fear, where does all that come from? For me, it comes from these places. Wyatt Earp's father was an overbearing man. He was blustery and stubborn. He was violent. He was known to crack people over the head with his cane if they disagreed with him about politics. Very confident man. Very footloose in that he couldn't stay put for a long while anywhere. I think that he ingrained in Wyatt, however, a great sense of duty. And that was one quality of the father, whose name was Nicholas. Nicholas went off and fought in the Mexican War and must have revered his commander, whose name was Captain Wyatt Barry Stapp. Because when Nicholas came home from that war, he named his son, his next son, after that officer. Wyatt's full name was Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp. Nicholas later would like to have fought in the Civil War, but he was too old at that point, so he served as a provost marshal to help organize and drill men and get them ready for war. So all of this sense of duty went into his sons, and he also taught them hard work. And the funny part about that is I think it backfired. I think all the farm work that they did convinced them that they would never do labor again as adults. The closest thing that came to labor for the Earp brothers would be chiseling away at a mine, I suppose, to strike it rich with a mother lode somewhere. Another thing that made Wyatt confident was his size. He is exactly my size, as a matter of fact, 6 feet tall, about 165 pounds. But in that time, that was a big person because of the nutritional factor. The average height of a man in those days was about 5'7", and the average weight would have been around 145 to 150. So Wyatt was a big man, and he was very strong from all of his farm work that he'd done. So pair that with a no-nonsense type of temperament and a willingness, a deliberation to go ahead with what needs to go ahead. And that's what separates him from most people. It's often said that among the gunfighters of the Old West, the one quality that they all shared was deliberation. They were willing to shoot. They were willing to kill. And that gives a person a little advantage over the person who has not really faced that yet and hasn't thought it through. I don't think Wyatt Earp had to think it through. It was just part of the straight ahead plan. I am a writer of fiction. That's really my love in writing. But I had to write this trilogy on Wyatt Earp because of my investment of time. My life has been spent really studying this person and all the peripheral things that go with that. Not just Wyatt Earp. There are so many aspects of the West that I've been taken with, like the Alamo and Billy the Kid. But I wanted to mention the fiction part of this for a reason. These 3 books, which are the trilogy, are considered historical fiction. And that's because I have put words into people's mouths that no one knows if they were spoken, actually. We know that some conversation took place and we know what the gist of it was, but we don't know how it was said and how it was received. So that's where a fiction writer comes in to try to flesh out a story. And my point is that even though this is historical fiction, the basis of it is in truth. And I tried as hard as I could to keep this story the true story. But you've got to start with the truth on that. Otherwise, I feel like, what's the point in doing this story about someone who really lived? Why not just make up a person and write this story about them? So that again points to an organization like WWHA. There's your resource right there. And, you know, with the journal that's put out by WWHA, that in itself could be the library of a historical fiction writer. You could learn what you needed to know from a few previous works on your subject matter, but always temper that with what's written in the Wild West History Association journal by modern researchers, because you're going to find so many interesting revelations there. I guess especially because my books are historical fiction, I had to be able to get inside of Wyatt Earp's head. And books that have been written about Wyatt, for example, take Casey Tiefertiller's book, which is probably considered the best book on the subject. Casey did not necessarily have to get into Wyatt's head to write his story in a nonfiction sense. So taking nothing away from Casey because of all the tremendous research that he did, I'm just saying that my approach to this required something additional. And so you can absorb those kinds of personality analyses by being a wide reader on the subject of whatever topic your book happens to be about. Okay.
I have a question.
All right.
What do you see as the difference between historical fiction and creative nonfiction?
I guess the difference in the two for me is, and you're probably going to get a different answer about this from every different writer. I guess creative nonfiction is considered to have been born with Truman Capote in cold blood. It was a new approach to telling a real, true story, but it took liberties. But this is what made it such a good book to read. I think of historical fiction, because the word history is in there, as one where the writer is obligated to follow history as well as possible. Creative nonfiction, since it doesn't have that word history in there, and in fact it has almost just the opposite, the creative part, that's where we can expect to veer from the storyline. But that's just my opinion about that. I don't know that there is a set definition about it. That's how I see it. One last suggestion that I'll give to writers: it's very important to know the environment of the place that you write about. And that's what helps your book to come alive with smells and sounds. And one advantage that I have is in my work, I'm very tuned into plants and how they were used by Native Americans. So I pay a lot of attention to the plants of an area. But what I'm getting at is this: I traveled to all of the places that are in my books on Wyatt Earp, and I needed to get a sense of those places, even if it were just to drive up and look at Dodge City from a bluff, just to get a feel of the land. That might be important, but I think to go deeper is even more important. Some of these things that I've mentioned today, I hope might be helpful to writers. And as far as others who have tuned in just to know or hear something about Wyatt Earp, I hope you'll read my books and get that slant on it. And also read the other books by Alan Barra and Lee Silva and Casey Tiefertiller And be sure to look for articles by Gary Roberts on Wyatt Earp. And read Gary Roberts' book on Doc Holliday, because it's a lot about Wyatt Earp in there. And who knows, maybe one day we'll all see each other at a book signing somewhere. Good luck to you with your writing, and thank you to WWHA for all that you do.